Hi friends, welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View. We have with us a very special guest, Mr. Gautam Chakrabarti. Gautam ji, welcome to the show. Gautam ji is
Namaskar.
connecting with us. He is in Berlin. He's based in Germany, and for the last several years, he has worked with several leading international institutes and universities as faculty member in his postdoctoral research. And he was also offered a tenure track assistant professorship in the history at the High School for Economics, Moscow in May 2024. But because of the geopolitical situation, he could not take that assignment. And we are going to put a detailed bio of Gautam ji in our description box. But to sum it up, so he works basically in the field of, the cultural history, the impact of cultural history, the crossroads basically, or the interconnections between geopolitics and culture, and especially in context of Russia. So he has done a had done a brilliant paper. I got hold of that paper, and then when I went through it, so I thought that we should talk about it. And today we are going to talk about the impact of basically Russia's cultural diplomacy in India, and how Russian cultural diplomacy was carried out, especially during the Cold War era, because it has a direct connect with uh, the current public discourse in India also, because a number of intellectuals who were, you can say, prepared or patronized or sponsored or influenced, so they continue to drive the public discourse significantly in India. Some of we They sometimes take the name of liberal. They sometimes call themselves, left. They sometimes call themselves centrists. So they are in the every field, and they continue to influence the public discourse. And when India is emerging as a global power. So, in this battle of narratives which India is fighting both outside and inside, so it becomes very important to understand the how cultural diplomacy was carried out. And Gautam ji is currently basically working because he's an expert in German. He also knows Russian. He also knows Bengali, Hindi, English, of course, he knows. So Gautam ji is right now in one of the leading global institutes in academic institutions in Germany. Because I don't know German, I cannot pronounce the German name. So I would leave it to Gautam ji to talk about a little bit about the universities whose name I cannot pronounce, and the kind of work which he has done. And along with that, then I'll just also put in my first question to Gautam ji. Gautam ji, first let's talk about basically the relevance of understanding this cultural diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. So why we need to understand it, and why Russia is important, even though uh, we have seen basically that Soviet Union got disintegrated, and now it's the Russian Federation. But still, no, it continues to have a significant portion of that Soviet Union. And as far as India is concerned, Indian and Russian relations, so they haven't undergone too much of a significant change, if I may say. Gautam ji will correct me on this thing, because there's certain finer nuances, especially with the geopolitical situation, the way it is developing. So Gautam ji, uh, the relevance of this work. But before that, if you can share with our viewers, the institute where you are working and the subject on which you are working.
Thank you so much, Arunji. Uh, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद आपका. Um, it is a pleasure to be on your podcast, and thank you so very much for the kind invitation. Um, I would like to say that I am now an associated member of the Institute for European Studies, Institut für Europastudien at the Europäische Universität Viadrina, which is translated as European University of Viadrina. So it's near Berlin. I'm based in Berlin. So I'm writing my second book, which is in the German system called a Habilitation, a sort of like a mega PhD, if you will, in the German system anybody who aspires to become a professor, uh, a senior professor, needs to have a so-called mega PhD, which is called the habilitats. And it's a bit like it's a threshold thing, right? Like the an NET, which people need if they want to become professors. Not that if they have it, they will, but yeah. So that's what I'm doing now. And I am working on, for this second book, the detective hyphen spy. I see it as a hyphenated figure, as a trope of selfhood in the Cold War and in uh, the modernist, and in what the Germans call moderne, that is the modern period. Not modern in the loose sense we understand it, but roughly the period of industrial modernity and cultural experimentation and the so-called new art and the new music, roughly speaking, the early 20th century, mid 20th century. So I'm looking at the detective slash spy from that perspective. But I am generally broadly interested in the cultural Cold War, cultural politics in the Cold War, specifically speaking between the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and India, and to a smaller extent, the Arab world and Afro-Asian countries in general, the non-aligned. So there's this concept called non-aligned modernity or non-aligned solidarity. So I also am looking into that. I'm learning. This is something I'm developing. I'm also interested in Indian Jewish cultural histories. So I'm looking at Nissim Ezekiel, who also had a role to play in the Cold War because he edited the journal Quest, which was funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which in turn was run by the CIA. So the New York Times revealed it in the in I believe the early 70s or late 60s in a four-part disclosure, and then it was wound up. So as we see from that, somehow if we are to study literature and culture in the Cold War, and I'm very interested in cosmopolitan networks, uh, vernacular cosmopolitanisms. I'm interested in what I call rooted cosmopolitans, and what I also call maverick cosmopolitans. Small groups, individuals who transcended Cold War ideological political barriers and boundaries and carved out spaces for themselves. And I think there are a lot of such cultural individuals from Afro-Asian countries and Eastern Europe who carved spaces for themselves in between the Americans and the Soviet Union. Just to give you an example, Ravi Shankar, Panditji, made was went to Woodstock. He was friends with the Beat Poets, the Beatles. The famous names of American transatlantic music and culture. He was a celebrity in the United States, but Panditji also played at the Dubrovnik Cultural Festival in former Yugoslavia. There's a CD and a YouTube video of that. Panditji also played in the Kremlin. We also know the album. We all know the album Ravi Shankar live at the Kremlin, right? So figures like Pandit Ravi Shankar from India, who traversed across the boundaries of the Cold War and carved out culturally uh, loaded, cultural spaces, which were also had a political, humanist, internationalist, cosmopolitan charge. So, in other words, the cosmopolitan aspects of what it means to be a modern Indian person. So that really interests me. And have also had stints. You mentioned my Russia Connect. It's true. Given the current world situation, it's very difficult for someone based in Germany to work in Russia, but I hope that will change sometime rather sooner than later. Um, I have also my PhD was from the Freie Universität Berlin, the Free University of Berlin. I've also spent time in the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, and I've also had a semester in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which is one of the world's most famous and important universities. My life has also taken me to places which are related very much to the Cold War. Come directly to your question about the Indo-Soviet Connect and what Russia means to India today. We we see a lot of discussions about Russian military hardware, especially nowadays the spare parts, and also Russian natural resources, meaning oil and gas. So these are the main themes of discussion when we talk of Indo-Russian relationship, of the Indo-Russian relationship. But I would like to suggest that, I mean, I am not a student of business. You are a student of economics, I believe. But I because of my work, I do look at economic and social theory, and in today's world, who doesn't? Or we all should. So given my understanding of economic relationships in the world today, we all know the very potent term from the stock market, goodwill, जिसको हिंदी में साख बोलते हैं ना, किसी कंपनी का साख, the goodwill of a company, the credibility of a company makes or breaks it in the stock market nowadays, right? I mean, it's not so simple, but yeah, I mean, broadly speaking. My argument, and I have shown this in my essay from Moscow with Love, Soviet Cultural Politics in Cold War, across Cold War India. I've also tried to show it in a smaller essay, which is part of a sort of larger work, which celebrates Francis Stoner Saunders's work on the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So in these works, I've tried to show that uh, cultural resonances, cultural affinities create the trust which is necessary for long-term, meaningful, stable, and solid economic, military, strategic, and other partnerships. So, in other words, in my humble opinion, hard power cannot operate without soft power. Otherwise, the USSR would have won the Cold War, which it didn't. It soundingly didn't. It's not. I mean, in many ways, the USSR had a military which was less robust than that of the United States, but in many ways not. In many ways, the USSR had a much more robust military industrial architecture than that of the United States. For example, in space and other fields of military technology, military civilian technology, the Soviets were actually the path finders. And there's this beautiful song called I won't say the Russian, but for your viewers, which a beautiful Soviet song which you should listen to on YouTube, which is called "Glory to Those Who Are Pioneers, Who Break the Path, Who are Pathbreakers." So, in the 1950s and 60s, the Soviets were clearly till JFK, John F. Kennedy landed Americans on the moon. The Soviets were clearly the pathfinders, the pioneers of space exploration and space research. So they had the technological leap till America caught on in the 1960s. And throughout the socialist world and places like India, and throughout places and in places which were not socialist, but were increasingly seeing socialism as the ideology of the future. I mean, today it might have been discredited as not being a practical, pragmatic strategy. But one has to remember that in from I would say, roughly speaking, the 1940s, when the world was traumatized by the massive violence of the world wars, especially the Second World War, till I would say even the 1970s, socialism was seen as the ideology of the future, the ideology of the future. Capitalism, the American system, was seen throughout Afro-Asia as being a decaying, soon to die system, which didn't turn out to be true. But I'm just trying to point at the importance the Soviet Union had for newly decolonized or in the process of decolonization countries throughout Africa and Asia. The Soviets heavily invested in this. They not only gave scholarships to young students who couldn't go to the West for whatever reasons, economic or others, in countries like in the smallest and least resource-rich countries in Africa, The Soviets were giving scholarships to young people to study in Moscow. There was an entire university in Moscow. It still exists, the Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University. So where a lot of Afro-Asian countries, students from a lot of Afro-Asian countries came. Earlier also, the Soviets organized the first International Youth Festival. There's a documentary on YouTube about this, how the Soviet ships picked up young communists and also other fellow travelers, not just communists, people who are open to the Soviet Union, and took them to Moscow. And the Soviets loved choreographing things. Like recently, people made fun of President Trump's parade, military parade, and said that President Putin and the Chinese leader and others are laughing at this parade. Uh, I would say with reason. I mean, I don't know if they were actually laughing, but I would say there's enough reason to do that. The Soviets knew how to do their parades and their public performances. So choreographed public performances was something the Soviets and Tito. You'll notice I don't say Yugoslavia because in many ways Yugoslavia was Tito, and Tito was Yugoslavia. The Federal Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia as a concept existed even before in the 1920s and 30s, but Yugoslavia as we know Yugoslavia existed. It basically the life of Yugoslavia was coterminous with the life of Marshal Tito, Joseph Broz. So both Tito and the Soviets, they and the Chinese nowadays, we don't cut a bad picture either. Our parades are quite interesting and exciting. But the Soviets are like, goose steps and absolutely choreographed parades. They knew how to put that, they knew the art of public diplomacy very well. So I would say it's a different kind of public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy than the Americans. The Americans are more into creating networks across Africa and Asia, and they were into funding journals like you saw. I mentioned Quest. There was a gentleman called Rajat Neogi in East Africa who had a very sad end in the United States later on in life to his life, but he was editing a very influential literary cultural journal in East Africa, which was again funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So, as you can understand from the name, Rajat Neogi was of Bengali origins, but he was born and brought up in East Africa. As we all know, East Africa had the sizable Indian diaspora, still has to a certain extent. So the point is, the Soviets clearly had this, they clearly ticked off on the coolness factor in the 1950s and 60s. As rappers say, the cool kids on the block were going Soviet. We all know our parents' generation or our uncles' generations of the ideologies. Now, here comes the interesting rub. The Soviets didn't just sit on this achievement. The Soviets made an exception for India. The Soviets realized, and this is what I try to explore, in the 1940s, Stalin was not interested in India. I mean, as long as Stalin was there, India, Pandit Nehru, and the entire Congress establishment was seen as being bourgeois capitalist, and Stalin even once is supposed to have called in a conversation Pandit Nehru as you know, as a cup bearer for the West or something like that. Not cup bearer, but someone who's like a subordinate ally of the West. But different levels of Soviet bureaucracy and academia were seeing in India a long-term investment. And after Stalin's death, with Khrushchev, immediately things start happening. Cultural delegations come. I've discussed this in my essay. So the first Soviet cultural delegation with the culture minister comes, through, in those days you flew through Yugoslavia, through Rome, to Aden, to Egypt, to Cairo, to Aden, then to Bombay, now Mumbai. So very exciting. There are books on this, reminiscences, travelogues based on this. Very exciting travel. The Soviets were deeply impressed. They were put up in the top floor of the Ashoka Hotel of the Taj Hotel, sorry, in Bombay. So they're deeply, deeply impressed. And we Indians know how to give people the royal treatment, should we so choose, right? different Americans and Russians and others have seen it. So we can turn on the charm, right? So we did this for the Soviets. Pandit Nehru did this for the Soviets, her daughter, of course, and Lal Bahadur Shastri, everyone actually. Because India was also, this is something the West doesn't still get about India, is that India has a civilizational past and present, but India is absolutely convinced of a civilizational future. A lot of the, if you pick up a lot of the chatter on social media, you see what is the West's problem with India? Why is President Trump ridiculously, in my humble opinion, inviting a Pakistani gentleman who just appointed himself field marshal as to lunch? Because, the West doesn't quite understand that India is deeply convinced, despite the problems, the still lingering poverty, we are deeply convinced of a future. And the experience of the last 80, 78 years has shown that we are working towards it with all sorts of hiccups and all sorts of deadlines. But this is what the West don't understand, doesn't understand, even now. So the West sees India as we will do things for you if you follow our line. The West doesn't get the fact that India has her own line. It still doesn't get this fact. And this is why there is a lot of Western disappointment. The Soviets got this as early as the 1950s. Please don't understand this to mean that I think that the Soviets were somehow more appreciative of Indian culture, religion, philosophies. I don't think so. I mean, I do think Russians in general are more open to Indian culture and philosophy and religion than Europeans and Americans. But at levels I guess we don't have to discuss here. But in terms of state policy, academic understandings, I don't think the Soviets or Soviet academia or the Soviet elites were really, they were interested in India. They liked India. And the Russians are, in general, shall we say, I mean, these are stereotypes. I mean, but as they say, in all generalization, there's a core of truth. So Russians in general, as a society towards African and Asian countries, there are lots of problems between Russians and Eastern Europeans, right? I mean, because of the Soviet experience, because of the Tsarist Empire. So current Russia is seen as an imperialist power in Eastern Europe, especially the Baltics. Um, we all know about the Ukraine-Russia war. But the Soviets and the Russians were perceived to be, and were also actually to a great extent were much less colonial, imperial in their dealings with Afro-Asian countries than the collective West. So this is a fact. So, but despite all this, despite the positive aspects, I don't think the Soviets really looked at India as, oh, this wonderful country we have to be friends with. The Soviets looked at India, as Russia perhaps does now, and as India does with Russia, as friendly, less snobbish societies and polities, which are best suited to collaborate with each other. This is why the Soviets made an exception for India in the 1950s. The Soviets never pursued, in fact, cut short all attempts to foment revolution in India, communist revolution. This is the only Soviet ally where the Soviets didn't want any regime change, never tried for any regime change. In fact, pressurized and molded the Indian Communist parties to work with the Congress Party. Because the Soviets' game in India was not a communist regime. The Soviets understood that revolution will never succeed in India. India is an entire civilization in itself. So even while the Soviets didn't care much for Indian ideas and culture and religions and philosophy, they collaborated what Indians thought was more an eye-to-eye basis. And I think this is the concrete advantage Russia has in today's India. I think Indian political and business elites are not that interested in Russia as the people are. If you follow chatter on social media, if you follow Twitter, if you follow I mean, If you talk with quote unquote Joe average on the street or Ganesh average on the street, right, to Indianize that idiom, you will see, I mean, all surveys that have been done of the general Indian attitude to Russia, it's it's pinned on this understanding that Rus hamara dost hai, Russia is our friend. Russia can be trusted. And fortunately for Russia, unfortunately for the West, when push comes to shove, even today, the collective West has shown that A, it doesn't treat India. It is not able to, even when the German establishment obviously wants to do business with India, obviously wants Indian labor and researchers and workers to come to India, one sees the problems there also. There is this from the Indian side, there seems to be an expectation of what in German we call Augenhöhe, which means talking equally on an equal footing. Whereas in the collective West, even though people don't express it nowadays as people like Nixon and Kissinger will want to express it, there is this understanding that India has a lot to catch up on. India is, and like recently there was this critique by, um, you know, important media outlets in the West that Indian journalism is ill-informed. Um, well, one could argue any journalism is ill-informed, right? I mean, there is a whole political establishment in the United States which calls mainstream media in the United States fake news, like the president himself calls
We have seen what
mainstream
happened in
media,
case of Iraq when all the Western media outlets were reporting about, weapons of mass destruction. The stories
you know.
basically, in journalism, I'll just add to this and then please continue. In journalism, we have an unofficial kind of a mantra. Uh, Many of the newsrooms, in fact, and that's actually the truth. They say that all stories are plants. We publish only authentic plants. So
Yes,
So I think the West
yes,
basically, but the West also has to look into its own kind of this thing. Past we have seen, there have been reports. I would have written about it. BBC, the kind of reporting BBC had done, basically their anti-Semitic attitude, their anti-Hindu. We saw basically when this Leicester violence happened. So some of the newspapers, the way they were reporting. And in fact, recently after Operation Sindoor, a number of anti-India stories which appeared. So all of them were, when one dug a little bit deeper, so all of them were done by basically, Pakistani journalists working or, the kind of, so many of them were Pakistani journalists and some of them were Bangladeshi also. So these were the stories. So all these stories were written by basically them. So the threads are available on basically, X about this, and even you can get it checked through Grok also, the viewers. So this is how basically I think probably I think the difference is, Gautamji, my experience is that the Western media, they spend a lot of money and resources on news gathering operation. So the reporters go to the field. Let's say if there is something happening right now. Let's say that Afghanistan war. So you see, Steve Call, people like they go. So there is a pattern. They go there, they
yeah,
stay there for 2, 3 years. Their organization support them. They do some stories, then they come back, then they do a book, then book becomes the reference point, and then they go and teach in the universities, work in the think tanks, and this is how this whole circle. And it's like you scratch my back, I scratch yours. So the Guardian journalist will support basically the Washington Post journalist in terms of promoting his or her book or
absolutely.
his or her research paper. So it's basically you are very well aware of this, musical
Yeah,
chairs. Yeah.
just to add, sorry to interrupt you, just to add something
Please
directly
go
to
ahead. Please.
that,
Yeah.
in terms of the Russians and the Soviets. You see, thank you for pointing these things out. You would know this much better as you are a senior journalist and you have, sufficient experience of the field. Whereas my understanding would be indirect because it would be uh, my, I mean, like, I guess everyone who claims a certain basic level of intelligence, if they if they have been reading news and consuming news since they were like 6-year-old boys, as I have, it's not as you know, as people would say, it's not rocket science to figure out that most news is plants, but we only publish the authentic plants. So, I mean, you mentioned the Iraq War. You also mentioned there are other cases in plant. I mean, it's basically, I think it is fairer and more helpful, more or less misleading to look at news cycles as competitive spins. So, of course, there are facts, and but the whole history of the Cold War shows how basically the United States won the Cold War. One of the ways it won the Cold War is I mean, as Henry Kissinger once mentioned. By the way, I have a very, I would say, ambiguous, not ambiguous. I would say I have a very two-sided uh, sort of understanding of Dr. Kissinger. For example, President Nixon, I think, was atrocious. I mean, the way he behaved with Mrs. Gandhi in the White House, all his policies, the fact being that he is one of this is perhaps the only American president who was booted out while still in office, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, President Nixon was, as the Americans say, a bad piece of work. But I am split on Dr. Kissinger. On the one hand, we have someone who's clearly dismissive about India. One of the things people don't know about Dr. Kissinger is he was one of the inspirations behind this mass sterilization campaign of Sanjay Gandhi. So, not directly, but Dr. Kissinger's one of his pet things was pushing, shall we say, was, you know, population control across the developing world, because obviously a lot of undesirable peoples getting in number and falling Euro-American quote unquote white birth rates is, uh, was a thing already then in the 50s, 60s, 70s. If you'll notice, Planned Parenthood, I heard this from an American colleague some days ago. If you see where the first Planned Parenthood centers in the US came up, they were overwhelmingly in African American neighborhoods. Uh, so there is a certain, shall we say, racist charge to uh, population control. Don't get me wrong. I
No,
mean,
no, no. I
hugely,
perfectly, yeah.
I'm hugely in favor of population control. I think it's very necessary for the planet. But this racist charge to it was part of Euro-American policy. I mean, it through different global bodies, this or that foundation. I mean, we know this whole architecture, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. I have covered that.
different,
Lot of basically this thing it used to be pushed by the international agencies.
yeah. I mean, if you've got your Ford or MacArthur or Rockefeller Foundation grants and you've done good work, then if you're a writer, for example, did you know Wole Soyinka, the African Nobel laureate? He was a Ford Foundation grantee, so he basically got a huge Ford Foundation grant, was supposed to write a book for it, but he basically didn't do it. And the Ford Foundation said, okay, let's give him some more time. And throughout Africa and Asia, we see American intelligence officers in the 1950s identifying quote unquote talent in different fields, literature, culture, science, technology, journalism. I'm sure we all know who the relevant people are in India as well. And then, either if you're a journalist or a social worker, you do good work and also work which suits Euro-American policy prerogatives. Then sometime you get a max essay, and then from max essay, if you really hit jackpot, you might even go on to get a Nobel Prize. So please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is all worthless. There are wonderful people to have won the Nobel Peace Prize, and I don't mean the science prizes. I mean even the Peace Prize. There have been really deserving causes and institutions and people who've got the Nobel Peace Prize. But I'm sure all of us realize that the Nobel Peace Prize was also got by people who absolutely had no claim to it. That's also true. So what I'm saying is this entire global architecture of, I call this an architecture of influence and an architecture of validation and influence, which is extremely strong and well entrenched because it works at multiple levels. So from the obvious upper levels, we're talking Davos and World Economic Forum at Davos and the fund bank, what people on the left call the Troika, right? The IMF, World Bank, and the WTO. So obviously those big levels, but also various smaller levels. Things like academic peer review, things like global funding networks. For example, during Corona, we saw how um, you know leading American biotechnologist and, shall we say, international science fixer, international virus research fixer. Basically, I mean, there's a very good New Yorker article about this written by one of America's leading science journalists. Now, this particular guy I will not name, the moment under both President Trump and President Biden, the presidents and other people started wondering why could, the first case of the virus erupting be just next door to China's level 4, biohazard level 4 laboratory? Is this really coincidental? Shouldn't we research this? And immediately there's a petition signed by some of the leading virus researchers or, gain of function researchers all over the world this is nonsense, this couldn't have been deliberate, or this couldn't have been an accident, this is a natural disaster. Later on, President Biden restarted the debate, and other people restarted the debate. Uh, uh, Secretary Kennedy Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. also talked about this, and a lot of scientists across the board, by no means conspiracy theorists, have said that the way this whole idea was suppressed in the early days of the COVID crisis shows how the system works, right? I mean, there are intensely enmeshed networks within academia, within the media, within culture, all these validation mechanisms. If you look at the validation mechanisms, rating systems for economies, corruption indices. Where is Transparency International based? In Germany. Is there no corruption in Germany? Of course there is, and Germans will tell you all the time. But it's packaged in ways which tick off well with you know systems that have been developed in Europe and America. In other words, again, I repeat this because I really believe we must be clear about this. Rejection of this whole system doesn't help, right? I mean, you cannot
Arushi, I was coming to
win
that. I just want to put in a small question here.
please.
Uh, do you think, because you've explained it so lucidly, this global architecture of influence. So, do you think that in India, at the policy making level or at the think tank level, I'm not only talking about government. Governments have a limited role to play when it comes to creating or influencing the influencer network. So it's a multi-stakeholder game. So, do you think that we have that kind of a consciousness or awareness, or somebody is looking at it closely? I'm sure some people might be looking at it closely, but overall in the public discourse, let's say if we take public discourse as a barometer, so do you see this kind of a thing? And if we compare it with Russia and the West, let's say, so what kind of awareness basically they have about it? In today's parlance, we call it basically the battle of narratives at times. But that's a this battle of narratives is only a small part of this larger influence infrastructure architecture. So my precise question is, what kind of understanding in India we have about this thing? Are we working on it? How do we go forward on it? And what we can, how the West is looking at it, how the West is working on it. and how Russia is basically, working on it. Because again, it still remains basically, it's Russia versus West, even after disintegration of US. So the Cold War continues in, another format. So how do you look at basically this? If I look at it, these three players, China, I'm not taking right now because China is a different ball game altogether. That needs a separate program. But because
Sure,
you have a specific interest in Russian kind of this thing legacy, the cultural legacy. So that's why I want you to make a small comparison of Russia, West, India in terms of global influence architecture.
sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, it fits in with what we have been discussing so far. I mean, because uh, I mean, I'm just a small fry in research on Russia. I mean, I look at basically Indo-Russian relationships, cultural political relationships. But it's interesting so I'm open to criticism of this position. But I think the major problem between Russia and the West is a recognition issue. I don't think post-Soviet Russia shares the Soviet Union's ideological mission. Uh, it may or may not. I mean, people in Eastern Europe and people in the West would say post-Soviet Russia has inherited the Soviet imperialist mantle, and the Soviet Union in turn inherited the pre-Soviet Tsarist imperialist mantle. I'm not getting into that. That's a different debate. But I do think post-Soviet Russia shares one thing at least, doesn't share the ideological mission the Soviet Union had. I mean, after Lenin, with Stalin, this idea of world revolution ended. With Leon Trotsky, Stalin basically literally axed the idea of world revolution by having Leon Trotsky axed in Mexico. So from there, it was socialism in one country, Russian state power, or shall we say, Russophone state power in the Soviet Union. But at least the Soviets had this internationalist mission, spreading the ideas of socialist solidarity. Uh, Even in the Russian anthem, the Soviet anthem especially, there are these words, uh, brotherhood of peoples. So this was one of the foundational ideologies of the Soviet Union. Even the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union is seen as a federation of different nations in that sense, a socialist federation of different nations with grassroots democracy. That's where the Soyuz Soviet comes in. Soviet basically means the council, uh, um, like Sovietsky Soyuz. No? So that's the Soviet Union, Russian Sovietsky Soyuz. Sovietsky Soyuz, Union of Soviets, and Soviets being small governing councils at different levels. It could be a workers' Soviet, it could be a military Soviet, it could be the Supreme Soviet, right? The supreme organization. Basically, you can say in that sense, theoretically, the Soviet Union was like Swiss democracy, direct democracy. Practically not, but you know what I mean. So at least the Soviets had this mission of spreading an alternative future for humanity to the world. I am quite convinced. I mean, I'm open to debating this, but I'm quite convinced post-Soviet Russia didn't never shared this. It was about maintaining Russia's state power and continuing Russia's, what Russians see as Russia's great heritage, uh, civilizational, imperial, scientific, cultural, technological. No? Russia is the biggest country on the planet, right? You may not like it, but that's people in Eastern Europe everywhere may not like it, but it's a fact, right? You can't change that fact. I don't think anybody in her or his wildest dreams thinks Russia is going to fall apart very soon. Who knows? But uh, at the time the Ukraine war started, people were sort of, I still remember in March 2024 attending a university Zoom meeting where obviously I wouldn't give you clear identities about who that was, but someone very responsible in the German politics was even fantasizing about, Russia breaking into three, four parts very soon. But fantasies apart, like there's this beautiful English proverb: "If wishes were horses, beggars would ride." Right? So fantasies apart, I don't think it's sensible to say that the Russia is going away anywhere soon. Russia has immense problems, especially because of the sanctions, turning into a military economy, being in some ways uh, maybe earlier China was Russia's, the Soviet Union's junior partner. I think in some ways, not all, but in some ways the tables have turned. Russia is very isolated. But as Napoleon said about France, this is France, it will remain. So big countries, like too big to fail. So it's these systems are too big to fail. Like if banks can be too big to fail, countries can also. So we have Russia, which doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere. We also have the fact that Russia is now on a collision course with the collective West, and that also meant I hope it changes soon, but it doesn't look as if it's going to change anytime soon. So the current Russian efforts to create an alternative narrative, they're now very strong, but they've been trying to do that for the last 10, 15, 20, almost 20 years. So I think it's with this, the initial post-Soviet Russian response to the West was finally, we'll be part of the West. We are Western. We don't want to be with these Central Asian folks. I mean, I'm putting it in very simple terms, but this is true. I mean, I've been hanging around in Russia and talking with Russians and reading about Russia for a long time, for long enough time to understand that I think if you ask the average Russian if she or he sees herself as European or Asian, they would say European. But like Russia's state symbol, the two-headed eagle, this is an old problem in Russia. Every few decades, there's this debate about whether we look east or we look west. That's why this double-headed eagle. Russia, in that sense, is the true Eurasian country. It's the truest It's Eurasian in the truest sense of the term, geographical and also ideational, psycho-emotional, civilizational, cultural. It is a fusion of Europe and Asia, which is why Russia is looked at with suspect. There's a lot of Russophobia in Europe. There's a lot of Russophobia in Europe. One has to say this. Maybe based on history, but everything's based on history, right? So one shouldn't. So I can I as as an independent, hopefully objective scholar, I wouldn't say that there is no Russophobia in Europe, which is not true. There is. It's very clear. Whether or not it's based on actual facts is a different story. So Russia now is trying to create an alternative narrative, weaponizing its older Soviet contacts across Africa and Asia and Latin America who were unhappy with America. One of the reasons India also plays a role in that is of the historic Indo-Soviet friendship. There is spin, there are foundations, there are narratives, and there are brute facts. The brute fact is in 1971, the US Seventh Fleet and the British were basically coming to at least blockade, if not directly involve themselves in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea against India. And it is a brute fact that the Soviet warships stopped them. It is a brute fact that the Soviets have, uh, Indian state power, Indian military power would have been much more impaired without the Soviet Union's support. It's the Soviet veto in the United Nations. Even today, Russia has consistently supported India on its core issues. Whereas, we dance with the West, we do, howdy namaste things. Most of our diaspora is in the West and they're well settled.
We
And
still look for
people like,
validation from we somehow have this complex that we still look for validation from the West.
thank you so much for pointing this out. This is my point. Indians are able to understand that the West, at least till now, is not a reliable partner. We can dance with the West, we can tango with the West, but when push comes to shove, we need to our own capacities, or we need to have friends who will deliver. Israel has been one such a firm. Russia till now still remains much more reliable when quote unquote push comes to shove. So this is one important thing to understand. Coming to the point of validation, yes, Germans have this word Jein, Ja und Nein, yes and no. Of course, we would love validation by the West, but not to the extent that we are blind, to the extent the Pakistani establishment is blind. Like, look at Pakistan. I mean, as Indians, we automatically take a very negative view of Pakistan. But for a moment, if we just relax, take a deep breath, and pretend we are not Indians and look at Pakistan, let's say, objectively, what's the story of Pakistan? I mean, I'll be generalizing in half a minute, but generalizations have a core of truth in them. Let's say I'm like, I don't know. Let's say I'm um, Serbian and I'm looking at Pakistan. I'm reading the history. What do I see? We see a country which had immense potential when it started. It's decently big. It had a unifying state ideology, political Islam. They pretended it to be moderate, but that soon fell apart. And it was basically a country based on genocide and ethnic cleansing, right? So, but still, I mean, it had technology, weapons, an educated middle class, a lot of progressive-minded people, intellectuals. In the Cold War, people like Faiz Ahmed Faiz was going to the Arab world and Central Asia. He was a prominent left-wing voice, a sizable left-wing progressive intellectual milieu, which corresponded with Indians and didn't support the military. So things were going on. The Pakistani elite's obsession with damaging India made which points to a lack of self-validation, right? If your whole identity is based on destroying your neighbor, that means you consider yourself to be no one, nothing, right? You don't have a positive view of your future. The whole of Pakistan's state ideology is about not being India, destroying India, giving trouble to India. In this, what has happened is that the West has shrewdly sucked Pakistan dry. As Indians, we are not supposed to feel sympathy for Pakistan, and I'm not feeling sympathy for Pakistan. I'm just observing from a distance. Look at what has happened to Pakistan. Its economy has degraded over the years. Its people, lower middle classes and run all over, take immense risks to go to Europe, to do jobs as restaurant waiters and stuff like that. Its elites exclusively have their money, children in the West. It enjoys, and for that, what does Pakistan have to show for that? Atomic weapons, for which parts were stolen all over from Eastern Europe, under the conniving eye of the Americans and the Brits. So basically, that's the story of Pakistan's atomic weapon. At least the Iranians are building their own bomb. Pakistan's is a stolen bomb. It's like there is, yeah, it's not the fruit of Pakistan's, which is why the US is worried about this, right? And I mean, the US doesn't care about Israel either. It's the US is bombing Iran because the US realizes that this is actually the only Islamic bomb, right? Because Pakistan's is not really an Islamic bomb. Pakistan's is an anti-India bomb. Pakistan cares two hoots about Islam or the Arab world or the Persianate world. Pakistan's entire agenda. You see, why? Why does Pakistan have this situation? Because it lacks self-validation completely. It says all sorts of things about, India, we being, Indus civilization, and even its missiles are named after no Indian Muslim. They're named after, Ghori and Ghaznavi, were Afghans and Central Asians, basically. So India, on the other hand, has a civilizational mission. We are still, sadly, deeply colonized in our minds and our mindsets, but that's gradually wearing away more and more. I would even argue, even in Nehruvian times, if you look at bureaucratic file notings, even Pandit Nehru himself, I mean, I think there is, whether someone likes Nehru or they don't like Nehru, I think we will agree that Pandit Nehru was, shall we say, India's most Anglophone and Europhone prime minister, roughly speaking. And I would say Pandit Nehru, I think we should agree, was a smart, charismatic person. I mean, we shouldn't, grudge people their due. But even he, although he clearly loved hanging out with Europeans and everyone else all over the world, foreign policy was his thing, right? But even there, he has this note of resistance and independence. So, this whole NAM architecture, which was created by the Nehruvian state, I mean, he didn't have to do it, right? I mean, he could have just aided the Americans against China. China was a clear and present danger, Tibet. But we see Nehru's inclinations going. I mean, once John Kenneth Galbraith came to India, Nehru confided in someone saying, deep down, I can't stand the Americans. They're too brash. They don't have manners. This is what Nehru is supposed to have said about a new American ambassador who came. So, what do we see there? We see this irritation at what he sees as snobbery, what he sees as talking down. Pakistanis had no problem with it. No Pakistani general or president or prime minister ever said something like that. They wouldn't dream of it. So, as you know, in social media, many anti-India trolls troll Indians as Sar. Like, we are supposed to be always doing Sar. For your non-Indian listeners, Sar is this sir. Like, we are supposed to always talk to white people as sir. But actually, it's the Pakistanis who do this all the time because they have reduced the raison d'etre of their whole existence to doing the West's dirty work. And now a Pakistani foreign minister has accepted it on camera. That all along the last 70 years, the Pakistanis have been doing the West's dirty work,
Mhm.
right? So I would disagree slightly that yes, we still want validation from the West, but actually throughout the national movement, throughout all other political movements in India, Hindutva, the socialist movements, the national movement, the Congress ecosystem, the unifying thread has been India's understanding of itself as a sovereign world power. So I will
Gautami,
give that
this
credit
is
to
what
us.
I call, the quest for selfhood.
Absolutely. I think
So,
This is what the West doesn't get about India.
you know, that
I don't think
it's a
anyone
very
gets.
selfhood for us. And it's
And
basically,
Russia,
yeah, please go ahead. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
sorry, please finish.
No, 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 please go ahead.
Here I think is the crucial difference between the Russian, Chinese, American, or Euro-American and understandings of India. So the West sees India as interesting, colorful, rich in culture, intellect. The West doesn't officially want to give its stamp of approval on Indian democracy. Even a few days ago, I went to a talk and the professor was saying uh, dictatorships like China and Russia, uh, you know, imperfect, lapsing, threatened democracies like America and India, authoritarian democracies like America and India, and perfect democracies like the European ones, which is such nonsense of the highest order. But anyway, there's that. So this is the prevalent Western idea about the West, about India, that, well, it is democratic. We have to accept. We can't not accept that. But it's not really a full democracy. And yeah, like I still remember the day India sent its uh, Chandrayaan landed on the moon. I was at my German doctor's chamber. Now, he's a very nice man and uh, he's a very gentle, kind man and always very stressed, as most German doctors are. And I was very excited when I was following this on YouTube, and I told him excitedly, India's landed this. He was brooding a bit, and he was like, later on, he comes to me and tells me, Indien ist ein komisches Land. Leute sterben aus Hunger und sie schicken Raketen im Weltall, which means India is a funny place, is a funny country. People are dying of hunger sometimes, but they're sending rockets to the moon. So you see, this age-old stereotype still exists in people. They can't accept the fact that poverty is not experienced everywhere at the same way. That the poor in India are even prouder of the rocket in the moon than are our elites, people like you and me, and the real elites, the political elites. So this they don't get because the West, through the two world wars, through the clash of empires and decolonization projects, has been turned into a place which is suspicious of civilizational projects because it has been brainwashed into thinking the only valid civilizational project is the Western one. It's easy to dismiss Russia and say it's a dictatorship. The Chinese, of course, are a dictatorship. But it's not easy to dismiss India as a dictatorship. It won't wash. It doesn't wash. Recently, and this is why I think hats off to the government of India for sending all these all-party delegations recently. Whether or not they really achieve what they wanted to achieve is a different debate. But I think this gesture, the signal this sends, is that there is across the board unity in India about one and one thing, which is India's civilizational sovereignty and India's civilizational alternative, right? This is very important. I think Russia acknowledges this and understands this, which is why you see Sputnik, Russia Today, the things they say in India, the way they market themselves in India, Russia Today especially, clearly tell us that they're trying to tap into this Indian pride. And I think they're going to be successful.
Right. Gautam ji, thank you so much. And there are a lot of other questions also which we had discussed, but the way this conversation went, so we are going to come back and for another conversation. And in that conversation, we are going to talk specifically about some films, theaters, and the literary works, and especially the work which Gautam ji you are doing, the detectives and the espionage, because that's very interesting, work, literary work, and that's very our viewers basically will look forward to that, and so I think largely, our viewers have any comment, they can put it in the YouTube comment box. If you have any questions, any disagreements, any criticism, any suggestions, so please feel free to put it in the YouTube comment box. We will be sharing that with Gautam ji also. And in our next conversation, we'll try to take up these points also, because I think the bottom line is, as Gautam ji rightly said, see, India's civilizational core is that we can agree to disagree. So,
Yes.
so that's how basically we have moved forward, through millenniums, and hopefully we'll continue to move forward. So, and especially in this era of cacophony, where people are trying to score brownie points over each other. I think it's better to have conversations, basically, where all of us can join in, put forward our viewpoint. As there is a saying in India, that the difference between the West and or the difference between the rest and the Indian context is that when we debate or we discuss, it's not basically to score a win over the other person or to defeat the other person, but it is basically so that we can reach nearer to the truth. So this is what you
Yes.
call the parampara vad, the tradition of.
Absolutely.
So Gautamji, thank you.
Shastrarth,
Yeah,
as the
Shastra. So
philosopher.
we'll continue these conversations with Gautamji. And Gautamji, thank you so much for taking time out from your busy schedule. And we'll be back soon. Viewers, if you have liked it, share it, like it, subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much, Gautamji.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.